The first thing I saw when the taxi turned onto my street was the sign. It stood sharp and obscene against the familiar backdrop of my azalea bushes, a brutal slash of red and white against the soft greens and pinks of the garden I'd tended for 30 years. Sold. The word was a punch to the gut, stealing the air from my lungs. I paid the driver with a trembling hand, my mind refusing to process what my eyes were seeing. This was my house. The house my late husband Bill and I had poured our life savings into. The house where our son Daniel took his first steps. It couldn't be sold. I hadn't signed a thing. I walked up the flagstone path, each step heavier than the last, my small suitcase bumping against my leg. I'd only been gone for a week, a trip to visit my sister in Savannah, a trip Daniel had insisted I take. "You need a break, Mom," he'd said, his voice smooth as honey. "Relax. We'll take care of everything here." I saw now what everything meant. The front door swung open before I could find my key. Daniel stood there, not with a welcoming smile, but with the tight, impatient look of a man trying to close a deal. Behind him, his wife, Sophie, hovered, her arms crossed, a smug little smirk playing on her lips. "Mom, you're back," Daniel said, his tone flat, avoiding my eyes. He gestured vaguely at the sign. "I was going to call you. Things moved faster than we expected." "Faster?" I whispered, my voice a dry rasp. "Daniel, what is this? This is my home." Sophie stepped forward, her heels clicking on the hardwood floor I'd polished just last week. "It was your home, Martha," she corrected, her voice dripping with condescension. "But let's be realistic. It's too big for you. The upkeep, the taxes. It's a burden. We found a lovely couple who made a cash offer. It's for the best." A cold fury, something I hadn't felt in years, began to smolder in my chest. "A burden? I paid the taxes last month. I scheduled the roof repair. This house is in my name." Daniel finally met my gaze, but his eyes were cold, devoid of the warmth I remembered from the boy I raised. "Actually, Mom, it's not. Not entirely. Remember those papers you signed last year? For the estate plan, you made me majority owner, 51%. That gives me the right to sell." The lie was so audacious, so barefaced, that it almost buckled my knees. I had signed papers, yes, but they were for a healthcare directive, or so they'd told me. They had used my trust, my love, as a weapon against me. He saw the shock on my face and pressed his advantage. "Look, it's done. We've already put a deposit on a nice retirement community for you. It has a craft room." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a thin stack of $100 bills, fanning them out like a cheap magician. "Here," he said, pressing the cash into my hand. "This is your share, $10,000. It's more than fair, enough to get you settled." The money felt like poison in my palm. $10,000 for a lifetime of memories, for the home Bill and I had built with our bare hands. I looked from the cash to my son's unyielding face, then to Sophie's triumphant one. They expected me to break, to cry, to argue. They were waiting for a scene. I gave them none of it. I slowly, deliberately, folded the bills and tucked them into my purse. My silence seemed to unnerve them more than any outburst could have. "Thank you, Daniel," I said, my voice eerily calm. "You're right. It's time for me to get settled." I turned without another word and walked back down the path, away from the sold sign and the two strangers standing in my doorway. I didn't look back. I crossed the lawn, my steps measured and sure, and walked directly to the house next door, to Eleanor's house. I climbed her porch steps, my heart a cold, hard knot in my chest, and raised my fist. I didn't ring the bell. I knocked. Not a polite rap, but a specific, rhythmic pattern. Knock, 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 knock. The secret knock Bill and I had arranged with her years ago. The knock that meant one thing. The wolves were at the door, and it was time to let the lioness out. The house wasn't just a house. It was a testament to a life built on calloused hands and shared dreams. Bill and I bought the land in 1988 with every penny we had. It was just a patch of Georgia clay then, dotted with pecan trees. He was a carpenter and I was a school teacher. We didn't have money for contractors, so we became our own. I remember spending entire weekends learning how to wire an outlet, my fingers fumbling and clumsy, while Bill, patient and smiling, guided me. He'd say, "Every nail we hammer, Martha, is a memory we're building. This house will remember us long after we're gone." He framed the walls himself, the scent of fresh-cut pine filling the air. I painted every room, my arms aching at the end of the day, but my heart full. Daniel was just a boy then, 5 years old, running around with a little plastic hammer, pretending to help. We'd sit on the unfinished porch in the evenings, drinking sweet tea from mason jars, watching the fireflies dance, and dreaming of the future. That house witnessed everything. It saw Daniel's scraped knees, his first heartbreak, his high school graduation. It held the echoes of his laughter and the quiet weight of my tears when Bill was diagnosed. When the cancer took Bill, the house became my sanctuary and my anchor. The silence was deafening at first, but the walls seemed to hold his presence. I could almost hear his voice in the creak of the floorboards, see his smile in the way the morning sun slanted through the kitchen window. I stayed, not just because it was my home, but because it was the last piece of him I had. I poured my widow's pension and my teacher's retirement into its upkeep. Every dollar I had went into that house. A new roof after the big storm in 2008, a new water heater when the old one gave out, a garden that became the envy of the neighborhood. When Daniel married Sophie, I was happy for him. I thought he'd found a partner to build a life with, just as I had with his father. They were struggling at first, buried in student debt and living in a cramped apartment. When Sophie got pregnant, they came to me. "Mom, we can't afford a place of our own," Daniel had said, his eyes filled with a desperation I knew all too well. Could we move in with you? Just for a little while, until we get on our feet." Of course, I said yes. This house was built for a family. I gave them the master bedroom, the one with the big bay window Bill had built for me, and I moved into the smaller guest room. I didn't mind. Seeing my grandson, Leo, grow up in the home his grandfather had built was a joy that filled the empty spaces Bill had left behind. I cooked, I cleaned, I babysat. I contributed my pension to the household bills, never asking for a thing in return. I thought we were a family, building a new chapter in the house of memories. Sophie, however, saw things differently. She came from money, and my simple handmade home was never quite good enough for her. She talked about updates and modernizing. She replaced the quilt my grandmother had made with a sleek gray comforter. She put my wedding photos in a box in the attic, saying they made the living room look dated. I swallowed my pride, telling myself it was a small price to pay for having my family under one roof. I didn't realize then that she wasn't just redecorating a house. She was systematically erasing me from it. She saw the home not as a legacy of love, but as an asset, a piece of real estate waiting to be flipped. And I, the woman who had laid the foundation, was just an inconvenient piece of old furniture that needed to be cleared out. The betrayal wasn't a single clean break. It was a death by 1,000 cuts, each one so small I barely noticed it until the wound was too deep to ignore. It began with Sophie's words, little digs wrapped in a smile. At a neighborhood barbecue, a friend asked about my famous rose garden. Before I could answer, Sophie chimed in, "Oh, Martha loves to potter around, don't you?" I could answer, "It keeps her busy." The words weren't cruel on the surface, but the implication was clear. I was a hobbyist, a child playing in the dirt, not the master gardener who had won local awards for 2 decades. I was being demoted in my own life. Then came the exclusions. Family photos were taken with a pointed, "Let's get one of just our little family unit," leaving me standing awkwardly to the side. Holiday planning happened in hushed tones in the other room. I'd walk in, and the conversation would stop abruptly. Daniel, my sweet Daniel, who used to tell me everything, began to defer to his wife in all things. "Sophie thinks it's best if," became the preface to every decision that pushed me further into the margins. The most humiliating moment came at my grandson, Leo's 5th birthday party. The house was filled with Sophie's friends, women in designer dresses who appraised my home with cool, critical eyes. I had spent all morning baking Leo's favorite cake, a 3-layer chocolate fudge monstrosity, the same recipe I'd made for Daniel's birthdays. As I carried it out, candles blazing, Sophie intercepted me. "Oh, Martha, you didn't have to," she said, her voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "We ordered a custom cake from that lovely little patisserie downtown. You know, something a bit more sophisticated." She gestured to a pristine white frosted creation on the counter. My homemade cake, with its slightly lopsided layers and gooey frosting, looked clumsy and pathetic beside it. I felt the blood rush to my face. The children didn't care about sophisticated. They cared about chocolate. But it wasn't about the cake. It was a public declaration of my irrelevance. I tried to retreat to the kitchen, but Sophie wasn't finished. She turned to one of her friends, and in a stage whisper I was clearly meant to overhear, said, "She means well, of course. It's a shame her memory is starting to go. She thinks she's still the matriarch of this house. We just let her play along. It's the least we can do for Daniel's nanny." Nanny. The word hung in the air, a final, brutal nail in the coffin of my identity. I was no longer the mother, the grandmother, the woman who built this home. I was the hired help, a charity case they tolerated out of pity. I looked at Daniel, pleading with my eyes for him to say something, to defend me. He just gave a weak, apologetic shrug and turned back to his conversation, busying himself with pouring another drink. In that moment, I realized my son was gone, replaced by this hollow man who stood silently by while his wife dismantled my life, piece by piece. I set the chocolate cake down on the kitchen counter, my hands shaking. I didn't say a word. I just walked out to the garden, my sanctuary, and sank onto the old stone bench Bill had made. I listened to the laughter from the house, a sound that no longer included me. I wasn't just being pushed out, I was being erased. And I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that they wouldn't stop until there was nothing left of me at all. They wanted the house, but to get it, they had to get rid of its history. They had to get rid of me. The secret knock wasn't born from paranoia. It was born from foresight. Bill had always been a man who saw the world not just for what it was, but for what it could become, for better or for worse. He'd seen the subtle shift in Daniel after he married Sophie, the way our son's ambition was slowly being curdled by her materialism. And he knew Eleanor, our neighbor, better than anyone. She wasn't just the sweet old lady next door who grew prize-winning tomatoes. She was a retired judge, a woman with a mind as sharp as a tack and a spine made of steel. Her husband, a dear friend of Bill's, had been a corporate lawyer. They were a formidable pair. One evening, about a year before Bill passed, the four of us were sitting on Eleanor's porch. We were talking about wills and estates, the grim but necessary conversations that come with age. Estates. Bill looked over at me, his eyes serious. "Martha," he said, "this house is your fortress. I built it for you, but a fortress is only as strong as its alliances." He then turned to Eleanor. "Elle, if anything ever happens to me, and if Daniel and Sophie ever try to push Martha out, I need to know you'll be her general." Eleanor didn't even blink. She just took a slow sip of her lemonade and said, Bill, you know I will. Martha is family. That's when they devised the plan. It felt a little dramatic at the time, like something out of a spy novel. A phone call can be ignored, Eleanor had said, her legal mind at work. A letter can be thrown away, but a signal, a specific action, is undeniable. It's a call to arms. So we created the knock, 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 knock. It was the rhythm of a woodpecker we used to hear in the pecan trees. It meant the situation was critical. It meant the plan was to be activated immediately. The plan itself was simple but brilliant. A legal safety net woven with Eleanor's expertise and Bill's deep understanding of property law. Bill had me sign the original deed in a very specific way, creating a little-known type of joint tenancy with rights of survivorship that had a unique clause attached. It was an old, almost forgotten bylaw in Georgia real estate. The clause stipulated that while a majority owner, which they had tricked me into making Daniel, could initiate a sale, the sale could not be finalized without the physical signature of the minority co-owner on the final closing documents, witnessed and notarized in person. Furthermore, Bill had placed the entire property into a revocable living trust years ago, with both of us as trustees. After he died, I became the sole trustee. The document they'd had me sign, making Daniel the majority owner, was a transfer of equity, but it did not transfer my power as the sole trustee. They had control of the shares, but I had control of the trust that held the house. It was a checkmate they didn't even know they were playing. Eleanor kept a notarized copy of the original trust documents and the deed in a fireproof safe in her study. "They'll come at you with paperwork, Martha," she'd warned. "They'll try to confuse you, to wear you down. They will assume you're just a fragile old woman. They will never suspect you have a judge in your corner." After Bill died, I almost forgot about the plan. Life with Daniel and Sophie was a slow, wearying battle, and it was easier to retreat, to hope for the best. But Bill's words echoed in my mind. Don't let them make you a guest in your own life. I held on to that, and I held on to the knowledge of the knock. Standing on my lawn, staring at that sold sign, with their paltry $10,000 in my purse, I felt a lifetime of quiet dignity curdle into cold, hard resolve. They had mistaken my kindness for weakness, my silence for consent. They thought they had won. They had no idea that they had just walked into a trap Bill and Eleanor had set for them years ago. As I raised my fist to knock on Eleanor's door, I wasn't a victim. I was the executor of my husband's final, loving act of protection. The moment Eleanor opened the door, her face transformed. The warm, neighborly smile vanished, replaced by the cool, assessing gaze of the judge she once was. She saw my face, saw the suitcase at my feet, and simply said, "It's time, isn't it?" I nodded, unable to speak past the lump in my throat. She ushered me inside, her home a sanctuary of quiet order and the scent of old books and lemon polish. Max, who had followed me across the lawn, was greeted with a scratch behind the ears and a bowl of fresh water. "Tell me everything," Eleanor said, leading me to her study. It was a room paneled in dark wood, dominated by a large mahogany desk. This was her war room. For the next hour, I recounted every detail: the trip to Savannah, the sold sign, the fraudulent papers, the cash, the nanny comment. I laid the $10,000 on her desk. The nanny comment. He said this was my share. Eleanor looked at the stack of bills with disdain. "The insult is the point, Martha. They wanted you to feel small, to take the scraps and disappear. They underestimated you." She stood up and walked to a heavy, black safe tucked behind a bookshelf. She spun the dial with practiced ease, and the heavy door swung open. She retrieved a thick manila folder and laid it on the desk. "Our copy of the trust, your power of attorney, Bill's last will, Everything is in order." Her phone was already in her hand. Her first call was to a man named David Chen, a notoriously aggressive real estate lawyer in Atlanta she'd mentored years ago. "David," she said, her voice crisp and authoritative, "I have a situation, pro bono, a fraudulent conveyance and elder abuse case. The perpetrators are the victim's son and daughter-in-law. They've placed a sold sign on a property she is the sole trustee of. Yes, they have a 51% equity stake, but they don't have the authority to close. I need you to file an emergency injunction to halt the sale and a lis pendens on the property immediately. It will tie this house up in court for years if they try to fight it." She listened for a moment, then smiled faintly. "Excellent. I'm sending you the trust documents now. The son's name is Daniel Myers. The realtor is a local firm, Peachtree Properties. Call their broker. Inform them they are facilitating a potentially illegal transaction and are exposing themselves to significant liability. That should get their attention." She hung up and immediately made another call, this time to the county clerk's office, to a woman she apparently knew from her days on the bench. She explained the situation calmly, referencing the specific Georgia code related to living trusts and property conveyance. By the time she was done, a hold had been placed on any title transfer for my property. I watched her, mesmerized. This was a side of Eleanor I'd only heard stories about. She was a force of nature. When she finally set her phone down, she looked at me. Now, for the fun part. She picked up the stack of cash Daniel had given me. "We are going to use their own insult against them." She divided the money into 2 piles. 5,000 will be David's retainer, just to make it official. The other 5,000, she said, a glint in her eye, will be for you. A little fun for what comes next. I felt a surge of something I hadn't felt in a long time. Power. Not the power to hurt, but the power to act. "What do I do now?" I asked. Eleanor smiled. "Now, Martha? Now we wait. We've set the board. They think they're celebrating a victory. They have no idea they've just been served a subpoena. Go get some rest in the guest room. Max is already asleep on the rug. Tomorrow, the show begins." As I left the study, I heard her on the phone again, this time with an old friend at the local newspaper. "Helen," she was saying, "I might have a story for you. It's about how one of Georgia's finest matriarchs is teaching her ungrateful children a lesson in property law." The first tremor hit their world less than 24 hours later. I was sitting in Eleanor's sunroom, a cup of chamomile tea in my hands, when I saw the realtor's car pull up to my house. A woman in a sharp suit got out, looking flustered. She marched to the sold sign, ripped it from the ground, and threw it in her trunk before driving off in a hurry. Eleanor, who was reading the paper, looked up over her glasses. "The broker from Peachtree Properties must have gotten David's call," she said with a satisfied smile. "No one wants to be an accessory to fraud." An hour later, I heard their voices from across the lawn. Daniel was shouting into his phone. "What do you mean you're pulling out? We had a deal, a cash offer." He paced the driveway, his voice a mixture of panic and fury. I couldn't hear the other side of the conversation, but I could imagine it. The buyers, alerted to a legal dispute, were running for the hills. Sophie came storming out of the house. "What's happening? Why did she take the sign?" "The buyers backed out," Daniel yelled, hanging up his phone. "They said their lawyer advised them against it. Something about a title dispute. How is there a title dispute? We have the paperwork." I watched them from the window, a silent observer to the unraveling of their scheme. Their confidence was crumbling, replaced by a frantic, gnawing confusion. They had been so sure of their power, so certain of my weakness. They couldn't comprehend that the game had a player they hadn't accounted for. The official blow landed the next day. A certified letter arrived, delivered by a courier who required a signature. I saw Sophie snatch it from his hand. She tore it open on the porch, her face draining of color as she read. I knew exactly what it was, a formal notice from David Chen's law firm informing them of the injunction and the pending legal action for fraudulent conveyance and attempted elder exploitation. Their world, once so secure, was now teetering on the edge of a legal abyss. The house they thought they had sold was now a legal liability, frozen and unsellable. Later that afternoon, another car pulled up, this time a process server. He handed Daniel a thick envelope, the lawsuit. From my quiet perch next door, I became the audience to their slow-motion collapse. The hushed, angry phone calls to their own lawyer, who likely told them how much trouble they were in. The shouting matches that drifted through the open windows at night, a symphony of blame and regret. This is your fault, Sophie. You pushed too hard. My fault? You're the one who stood by and let it happen, you spineless coward. The most satisfying moment came on Friday. Eleanor's friend at the newspaper had published a small, carefully worded article in the local section. It didn't use our names, but the details were specific enough. Local family and property dispute amidst allegations of elder exploitation, the headline read. It mentioned a son tricking his widowed mother into signing over her home, only to be thwarted by a forgotten clause in a living trust. The article was a warning shot, a piece of public shaming that would spread through our tight-knit community like wildfire. That evening, I saw them through the window, sitting in their darkened living room. They weren't talking. They were just staring into space, the reality of their situation finally sinking in. They had tried to erase me, to cash me out for a paltry sum and lock me away in a retirement home. Instead, they were the ones who were trapped, their asset frozen, their reputation in tatters, and their future uncertain. They had built their foundation on a bed of lies, and now, thanks to Bill's foresight and Eleanor's brilliant execution, the ground was giving way beneath their feet. They had no idea where the attack was coming from, and that, I realized, was the most potent weapon of all. They came to Eleanor's house on Sunday evening, just as the sun was setting. They didn't come together. Daniel arrived first, knocking softly, his face pale and drawn. When I opened the door, he looked not at me, but at the floor, like a child summoned to the principal's office. "Mom," he began, his voice barely a whisper. "Can we talk?" "Please." I led him to the living room, where Eleanor sat knitting, a silent, formidable presence in the corner armchair. Daniel shifted his weight, his expensive suit looking rumpled and ill-fitting. "We got the letter from your lawyer," he said, finally looking up. His eyes were red-rimmed. "Mom, this is a mistake. We can fix this. We'll give you the house back. Just call off the lawyer." I took a slow sip of my tea before answering. "You think this is about the house, Daniel?" I asked, my voice calm and steady. "This was never just about a building. This was about respect. It was about love. You tried to sell my life from under me for a quick profit. Love. You can't fix that with a negotiation." Just then, the doorbell rang again. It was Sophie. She looked even worse than Daniel, her usual polished perfection replaced by a wild, desperate look in her eyes. She brushed past me and confronted him. "Did you tell her? Did you offer to give it back?" Then she turned to me, her voice a high-pitched plea. "Martha, please. We were wrong. I was stressed. I wasn't thinking clearly. The things I said, I didn't mean them. We'll tear up the papers. We'll do anything. Don't let this ruin us. Think of Leo. Using my grandson as a shield. It was her last, most pathetic gambit." "I am thinking of Leo," I said, my voice hardening. "I'm thinking about what kind of man he'll grow up to be. Will he learn that it's okay to discard his family when they become inconvenient? Will he learn that love is conditional and loyalty has a price tag? Or will he learn that actions have consequences, I stood up and walked over to the window, looking out at the silhouette of my home against the darkening sky. You didn't just try to sell a house. You tried to declare me worthless. You called me a nanny. You threw the cake I baked for my own grandson in the trash. You took the $10,000 you thought was my entire life's value and tried to buy my silence. I turned back to face them. They were both staring at me, their faces a mixture of shock and dawning horror. They had never heard me speak this way, with this much quiet fire. The lawyer is not being called off, I stated. The injunction stands, because this is no longer about you fixing your mistake. This is about me reclaiming my life, the life you tried to steal. Sophie began to sob, not with regret, but with the frustration of a spoiled child whose favorite toy has been taken away. But what will happen to us? Our reputation, the money we were counting on. Eleanor finally spoke from her chair, her knitting needles clicking softly. You should have thought of that, she said, her voice cutting through the room like a judge's gavel, before you decided to commit fraud against your own mother. Daniel sank into a chair, his head in his hands. I'm sorry, Mom, he mumbled into his palms. I am so sorry. I let her. I went along with it. I failed you. I failed Dad. It was the first genuine thing he had said, a flicker of the boy I once knew. But it was too little, too late. Yes, Daniel, I said softly, the anger draining away, leaving only a profound sadness. You did. I didn't offer comfort. I didn't offer forgiveness. I simply let them sit there in the wreckage they had created, forcing them, for the first time, to see the true cost of their greed. The price wasn't a house. It was a family. And that, I knew, was a debt they could never repay. In the end, there was no dramatic courtroom battle. Faced with irrefutable evidence of fraud and the threat of a public, drawn-out legal fight that would ruin them both socially and financially, Daniel and Sophie conceded. They signed a document, drafted by David Chen and overseen by Eleanor, that nullified the 51% equity transfer completely. They also signed a formal agreement to vacate the property within 30 days. The house was mine again, wholly and unequivocally. They left on a rainy Tuesday, packing their lives into a moving van under a gray, weeping sky. I watched from Eleanor's window as they carried out boxes of expensive furniture and designer clothes. Leo, my grandson, seemed confused, his small face pressed against the car window as they drove away. My heart ached for him, the innocent casualty in a war he didn't understand. But I knew this was a necessary pain, a harsh lesson that would hopefully save him from making the same mistakes as his parents. I didn't move back in right away. The house felt tainted, filled with the ghosts of their disrespect. I stayed with Eleanor for another month, healing, breathing, remembering who I was. We spent our evenings on her porch, drinking tea and talking about everything and nothing. Max, my loyal Max, never left my side. One day, I knew what I had to do. The house was not meant for me anymore, not alone. Its purpose, as Bill had said, was to be a fortress, an alliance. Its purpose. I called a meeting with the board of a local charity I had admired for years, a nonprofit called The Sparrow's Nest, which provided safe housing and support for elderly individuals who had been victims of abuse or neglect. I met them in my old living room. I told them my story, and then I handed them a new deed. I was donating the house in its entirety to their organization. It would be converted into a beautiful communal living home for up to 6 residents. They were stunned into silence, then overcome with tears of gratitude. The home built by my husband's hands would once again be a place of safety, love, and dignity. Not for me, but for others like me. My only condition was that the garden be maintained and that there would always be a room for a resident's dog. They named it the Martha and Bill Myers Sanctuary. I used the $10,000 Daniel had given me to put a down payment on a small condo by the lake, a bright, airy space with a balcony where I could grow my roses in pots. It was all I needed. Eleanor helped me move in, and Max immediately claimed the sunniest spot on the rug. I see my grandson every other weekend. Daniel brings him, and our visits are quiet, tentative, held in the neutral territory of public parks and ice cream shops. The relationship is not what it was, and perhaps it never will be. It is a fragile thing, being rebuilt on the hard-won ground of respect instead of the shifting sands of obligation. Sophie, I hear, is in therapy. I hope she finds peace. Sometimes I drive by the old house. I see the lights on, see the residents sitting on the porch I painted, laughing together. I see the rose garden, blooming more vibrantly than ever. It is no longer my house, but its legacy is mine. They tried to erase me, to reduce my life to a $10,000 buyout, but they failed. I am not a ghost in an attic, nor a nanny, nor a charity case. I am Martha Myers, and this is my home, my story, my victory.